All right, this is the tutorial for the midterm for this year, and we'll go over many different stories. The first thing we'll start with is the minister's black veil. And the minister's black veil is a parable, and basically what a parable it teaches a message. You know, it has a moral to it that you're supposed to learn from, and in the story as a parable, the parishioners have such an intense response to seeing the minister's veil because it reminds them of, you know, basically they're frightened by it. You know, they've got somebody who's wearing like almost a facial mask, and it's just it's very odd and it's unnerving. When Mr. Hooper gets ill or starts to get ill, the person who takes care of him is Elizabeth, which is not his wife, but a woman who he was engaged to. Moral lesson of the story is essentially that basically a guilty secret separates us from one another, and it tends to happen that we all wear masks, and that could be, you know, a social story as well. Could people protect their personal privacy by wearing a public mask, not a physical one, but one that, you know, hides who they are? In Of Mice and Men, some of the questions that go with it is George at the very beginning tells Lenny to hide in the brush in case there's any trouble. And during the story, when George kills Lenny, he does it with Carlson's Luger, or his gun. The men tend to joke about Curly because, you know, he wears a Vaseline-filled glove. And when they first meet the boss, George tells tells the boss that Lenny's his cousin. And Curly doesn't care much for Lenny because he's a big guy, and he doesn't like people bigger than him. And while Lenny and Curly's wife are in the barn, the men are throwing horseshoes. And what Curly's wife wants to know from the guys is what happened to Curly's hand. The reason George and Lenny left weed at the beginning is Lenny frightened a girl by grabbing onto her dress and tearing it. After learning of the murder, though, George essentially gives up the dream. It's because without Lenny, it's not much of a dream. The only one who understood George's actions at the very end was Slim. Slim's job on the ranch was he drove mules. He was a mule driver. And he was highly regarded by the ranch workers because of his skill as a jerkline skinner. The idea of a motif, this is a reoccurring subject, theme, or idea that's used over and over again, which is to live off the fat of the land and have their own home. An allusion basically allusion is a figure of speech making reference to a story, place, or event that is used in a story. Going on to the next story, creation myths. What happened to the wife after the chief uproots the tree of knowledge? She basically falls into the hole. And the reason the chief ordered the young men together to uproot the great tree was basically under his wife's orders. Who saved the woman from falling to her death, essentially, were the swans that flew up in the air and helped her. And then the one animal that helped her create the earth was the muskrat. He was able to go down and get some dirt. According to the creation myth, in the beginning, the sky spirit's biggest animal, which walked on 2 feet, was a bear. And the problem that happened to the chief's daughter, she fell out of the mountain and ended up living and marrying one of the bears. Moving on to the Salem witch trial, let's talk about some historical facts from Salem. There was 20 people executed, or actually 19 people executed during the trials. The name of the hill that people were hung on was Gallows Hill, and the Puritans came to the New World in 1630. The children who began accusing witches at the beginning helped start the entire hunt in Salem, though there was only 3 of them to start off with. In 1486, there was a book written that was kind of like a guide on how to find and get rid of witches, and that was called The Hammer of Witches. Basically, Giles Corey, even though he was one of those who died in the witch trials, he was tortured to death by pressing, which took 36 to 40 hours. The name of Sarah Good's child, who was one of the youngest arrested, was Dorcas. And whenever a victim had evidence in court that they were being attacked by a witch, it was called spectral evidence. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who is the great-great-grandson of Judge Hawthorne, wrote The House of Seven Gables. And currently today, there are over 4,000 people living in Salem as witches. And one of the theories behind what started the witch trials was the widespread in the wheat called ergot, which is a drug which causes hallucinations and also violent tremors. In the crucible itself, Thomas Putnam, he is basically a vindictive, spiteful man only interested in property and money. Most of the villagers view Rebecca Nurse, though, as a very kind and respectful woman, very religious. Reverend Parris himself, though, is most concerned with his reputation and his job. We can infer that the citizens of Salem thought dancing was evil and sinful by the way they reacted to hearing that girls were dancing out in the woods. John Proctor, probably the best way to describe him is he rebels against authority, and he speaks his mind, which doesn't make him very popular among authority. His wife Elizabeth urges John to go to Salem, essentially to tell the court that Abigail's story is a hoax, which she tells John. And during that time, as she gains power, basically people part like the Red Sea's for because they don't want her to, they fear that she'll accuse them, and they know what kind of power she has. The first person accused in the witch trial in this story was Sarah Good because she couldn't recite the Ten Commandments. When Abigail says to Danforth, "You think you might be so mighty that the power of hell may not turn your wits? Beware of it," she basically is in court threatening Judge Danforth himself. Elizabeth Proctor does not tell Danforth Abigail is a harlot, essentially because she wants to save John's reputation, and she doesn't want him to get in trouble for adultery. Giles Corey is arrested because he refuses to accuse or essentially name the person who accused Putnam of grabbing land. Hale denounces the proceedings in the court in the third act just simply because he believes the testimony of Mary Warren and John Proctor. And now it's important for Danforth and Parris in the fourth act to have Proctor confess because they're worried about the people rising up against the courts. And essentially the climax in Act 4 comes when John Proctor basically rips up his confession and decides that he will rather receive a hanging than a false confession. What is Parris's real reason for wanting Proctor saved essentially is that he's afraid that the his own reputation and safety is in jeopardy. And Danforth refuses to postpone the hangings because it makes it look as if he wrongly executed those people, which he did, and he knows it. One of the factors that show the effect of these choices that are hitting the village is cows are wandering loose on the high roads because essentially their people are in jail, their masters are. Okay, moving to the Devil and Tom Walker. One of the important conditions of Tom's deal with Old Scratch, a.k.a. the Devil, is that basically he'll lose his soul in making the deal. After Tom does make the deal with Old Scratch, his name probably is assumed as recorded in the swamp on the tree. Early in the story, the narrator says that the skull Tom finds indicates that the swamp was originally an Indian battleground. And the narrator indicates that Old Scratch doesn't frighten Tom because as frightening as the devil is, his wife is worse. So we could assume that the relationship between Tom and his wife is like cats and dogs, always fighting. Tom's wife probably disappears because she's taken after trying to make a bargain with Old Scratch and couldn't pull it off. The disappearance of his wife essentially makes Tom honestly grateful because he's excited that she's no longer there. Well, in negotiating the deal, Tom rejects the devil's first suggestion of being a slave trader because he doesn't believe in the selling of flesh. So that Old Scratch can't take him by surprise, though, after Tom has made all his money and he doesn't want to pay his debt, is to essentially carry a Bible in his pocket. Moving on to the next one, the Raven. At the end of the poem, the speaker assumes the ravens essentially come from the hell or the shores of the underworld. The rhyme scheme of the Raven is A, B, C, 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 B, which is or actually that's incorrect. It is A, B, C, B, 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 which is kind of like eat, wait, sight, fate, slate plate. So A, B, C, B, B, B. At the beginning of the poem, the speaker's immersed himself in books in an effort to try and forget about the lost Lenore who has died. At the beginning of the poem, the tapping essentially startles and scares or threatens the narrator. The raven brings the speaker essentially continual reminders of Lenore, the woman that he loves and has lost. In general, the words that are most often repeated throughout the poem is nevermore. And at the end of the poem, the raven is still there, as it would say that this hole or this thing in his life is still there, and that it never goes away. Poe's mom, wife, and adopted mother both died from TB, and Poe's wife actually was 13 when they first married. The kind of writer Poe embodied he was a psychological writer, and he actually died in Baltimore, Maryland. And then the rest of it is Frederick Douglass, which you just took the other day, so I don't have to really revise or review that. And that's it. Good luck on your midterm, and you should do fine.